Welcome, friends. It is truly a pleasure to be able to, with you, open the Holy Book and to examine the things that the Holy Spirit commanded the different writers to speak. But we've been studying from one particular writer, and that's writer John, the Apostle John. And we're studying of the 5 works that he wrote, the Gospel. The 5th chapter of the book of John has a very interesting story. Jesus had been in Galilee, and he returned from Galilee to Judea, to Jerusalem. And as he walked along, he came to a pool that's called the Pool of Bethesda. There he saw a man that was sick and had been sick for a long while. There was the understanding, the belief by those that came to the pool that there was healing in that pool, and that at a certain moment when the water was bubbling, that the one that stepped into that pool first would be healed of whatever infirmity it was. And so many individuals that were sick were ones that came. And this man lay many years in his illness. Jesus knew he'd been ill a long time. Jesus, of course, knew all there was to know about this man, just as he knew that when Nathanael came to him, that prior to his coming and his ever meeting him, that Nathanael had been under a fig tree, and many wondrous things had occurred to him. And just as he knew that a woman whom he saw in a synagogue had been 18 years all stooped over and couldn't straighten herself up. Just like he knew that the woman that he met in a well in Samaria had had 5 husbands and was living with a man that was not her husband. Jesus knew this. And so he said to the man, would you be whole? And he said, well, I have no man to put me in the water when the water is stirred. And Jesus said, pick up your bed and walk. And he did. This created quite an uproar on this day because it was the Sabbath day. And as we look in Jesus' activities, we find that Jesus worked many miracles, and he didn't confine those miracles to just 6 days. He worked these miracles 7 days, which included the Sabbath. And it was on the Sabbath that this miracle wrought. Many of the miracles that we're familiar with were ones that Jesus worked on the Sabbath. We find he healed a man that had a withered hand in the synagogue on a Sabbath day. We've spoken earlier of a woman that had been ill for 18 years and couldn't straighten herself up. And Jesus healed her in a synagogue on the Sabbath day. Jesus walked by on a Sabbath day and found a man that was blind, never seen, and he healed him. And while Jesus performed many miracles on the Sabbath day, during the week, the Sabbath day was no exception. But it wasn't just the miracle that Jesus wrought on this occasion that put him in conflict with the Jews. He was in conflict with Jews because first they saw the man he had healed. He was carrying his bed, and that was contrary to the law. And they said, it's not lawful for you to carry your bed on the Sabbath day. He said, the man that healed me told me to. And they said, who is he? He said, I don't know. He's conveyed himself away. Later, Jesus did find that man and tell him, you're whole. Sin no more, lest the worst things fall you. And that man went immediately and told the Jews. It was Jesus who told him to carry his bed on the Sabbath day. And this provoked an uproar with them. And as they conferred with Jesus and they contradicted and argued with him, Jesus justified what he did by the fact that my Father works even until now, and I work. And so in John the 5th chapter, the record says, and for this cause the Jews persecuted Jesus because he did these things on the Sabbath day. For this cause, therefore, the Jews sought the more to kill him, because he not only brake the Sabbath, but also called God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Now, these are not the words just of John as he wrote off the cuff. These were things that the Spirit commanded him to write. And the Spirit commanded him to write what these individuals said about Jesus, and that Jesus brake the Sabbath and also called God his own Father and made himself equal with God. Did Jesus make himself equal with God? Yes, he did, because he was. In Philippians, the second chapter, the Bible tells us that we should have this mind in us as it was in Christ. He says, in the form of God, and counted not being on equality with God. He was equal with God, a thing to be grasped. And there is a sense in which Jesus did break the Sabbath. But when we say he broke the Sabbath, by no means are we saying that Jesus sinned in what he did. When we look at this, we must recognize that the Bible tells us of different ways that Jesus, in conflict with these Jews, justified himself and taught that what he did was no violation of the law, but that it was right. And as we look at him in controversy with whether it was this man in John 5 or whether it was the woman that had had an infirmity for 18 years, Luke the 13th chapter, or whether a man was withered in, or whether it was a man that was born blind, John the 9th chapter. Varied things Jesus spake to the individuals. On one occasion, when he was charged with breaking the law and sinning because he did, Jesus said, which of you, if you have a sheep that falls into a pit, are you going to leave him there? Or are you going to lift him out on the Sabbath day? On the other hand, which of you, if you've got an ox, an ass that's in the barn, tied up, and it's a Sabbath day, are you going to leave him there all day long and not lead him away to the watering? Well, they knew what they would do. They would lift the sheep up out of the pit, and they would carry an ox and loose him and carry him to water. Now, the disciples had walked through a field on the Sabbath day. They were hungry, and they broke grains of corn and ate. And the Jews said, they're sinning. They're not lawful to do that on the Sabbath day. Well, did they violate the law? Perhaps technically. Did they sin? No, because there are some things that are things that are understood that man must do. Man doesn't quit eating, and man didn't quit eating on the Sabbath day because it was a Sabbath. Man didn't quit doing other things that were simply of the personal nature, washing himself, or, as it were, preparing a matter of a meal for his family. He felt the needs. He couldn't light a fire, but he could prepare the needs of his family and feed them. He could do those things. And we find that when Jesus called these things in question, was he justifying himself on the basis of what somebody else did that was equally wrong? That happens a lot of times. Our children may ask, can I do this? And what they want to do is wrong. And we say, no, you cannot. But they say, but Daddy, everybody else is doing it. Was that what Jesus was doing? No. No, Jesus wasn't justifying himself and wrong that he did by wrongs that others did. We have to recognize that sometimes two things that are right and good may conflict with one another. How could that be? Well, let's illustrate it. The Bible teaches that the priest under the law had specific responsibilities. And those specific responsibilities were that as far as the keeping of the tabernacle, that they were to offer morning and evening sacrifices, a lamb, an animal, that went on day by day. There was the offering up of the incense, morning and evening. The candlesticks had to be lit in the tabernacle every day. Now, when the Sabbath come, did they not light the candles? Did they not offer the animals? Did they not offer the incense? Of course they did. Consider something else. The birth of a child is a wonderful event for parents. And when a son was born to the Jewish family, there was the responsibility that if that son was going to be a part of the nation of Israel and in covenant relationship with God, he had to be circumcised on the 8th day. Now, Jesus asked them, what are you going to do? You have a son that was born. But the law is specific, circumcised him on the 8th day. Suppose that day, that 8th day, is the Sabbath. Are you going to wait till the next day or do it one day beforehand? Of course not. They knew what they were going to do. They knew that they were going to fulfill that law and circumcise that male child on the 8th day. Now, the Bible taught that individuals had a right to eat. But the matter of the disciples breaking grain was not harvesting. They were forbidden to do that. It involved simply the matter of lifting grain from the stalk to their mouth. The law forbade them, when they went through a field, that they could harvest it. They could eat enough to satisfy their hunger, but they could not harvest it. And the disciples were not harvesting that crop. They were satisfying their hunger. What these men did when they lifted up a sheep out of the pit was a good thing. They didn't do wrong. When they satisfied the hunger of that ox or the thirst of that ox or the donkey, they didn't do wrong. Friend, when things like that occur, we have to realize that what is specific to be done on a particular time, and that time falls, whether it's the Sabbath day or not, must be done. And so it was. And when Jesus looked at these individuals, he justified himself, and he responded by teaching them, my Father worketh unto now, and I do. You think God, to the Jew, shut his ears off on the Sabbath day and he wouldn't listen to them? Or the needs that they had on the Sabbath day, he wouldn't supply them? You know better than that. God sees our needs, and he supplies the needs of those individuals, whatever day of the week it was. And he listened to the prayer of his penitent children, their urgency and their needs. It didn't make a difference whether it was Sabbath day or whether it was Wednesday. Yes, he ceased his labor from the creation of the world. He rested on the Sabbath day, but he didn't cease any activity at all. So Jesus said, my Father works until now, and I work. But think of other things that Jesus said as he sought to justify the practice that he did. He said, man wasn't made for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for man. I'm not to be a slave. The Jew is not to be a slave to the activities of any activities that they might do on the Sabbath. They just sit down and absolutely do nothing. He was given the Sabbath to provide for himself a day in which he could rejuvenate his energies as well as his stock as well. Jesus not only said that man wasn't made for the Sabbath, but the Sabbath was made for man. He said, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And then he made this statement. He said that the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. Now, we'll be deviating a bit from our studies in our next study. But since we were discussing the matter of Jesus violating the law, we think it wise to follow that up in our lesson by asking the statement, well, is the law, the Sabbath, is the Sabbath binding today? We think you will find that an interesting study, and we invite you to join us for it. Thank you, friend, for having studied with us today.